The locksmith's van was still in the driveway when I pulled up, and that was how I knew something was wrong before I even turned off the engine. It was a Tuesday, 4:42 in the afternoon. I remember the time because I had glanced at the dashboard clock out of habit, the same habit my father taught me. Always know what time something happened, Josie, because someday you'll need to prove it. I didn't understand what he meant back then. I understood it completely by the time the story was over. The man from the locksmith company was crouched at the front door of the only house I had ever really lived in, drilling out the old brass deadbolt my father installed himself the summer I turned 12. My stepmother, Diane, stood behind him with her arms crossed and her sunglasses pushed up into her blonde highlights, watching him work like she was supervising a renovation on a house she had built with her own 2 hands. She saw my car. She didn't wave. "You'll never own anything, Josephine," she said, before I had even gotten both feet out of the car. Not hello, not a single softening word. Just that, delivered flat and certain, like she was reading me a weather report. "This house is mine now. I'd start looking at apartments if I were you." I stood there in the driveway in my scrubs from the dental office, still smelling like fluoride and hand sanitizer, 21 years old and 8 months and 11 days out from burying my father, and I felt my whole chest go still and quiet, like someone had reached in and turned the volume of the entire world down to nothing. She had absolutely no idea what she had just done. Neither did I, not fully, not yet. But in 11 days, everything about that house, and everything about her, was going to change forever. My name is Josephine Hart. Everyone calls me Josie. I am 21 years old, and until that Tuesday afternoon, I believe my life was simply hard in the ordinary way that a lot of young women's lives are hard. A father buried too soon. A stepmother who had never once looked at me like I belonged in her family photographs, a 2-year associate's degree I was chipping away at 3 classes at a time between shifts at Dr. Okafor's dental office on Route 9. I did not know that I was, at that very moment, one of the wealthiest 21-year-olds in the entire county, and that the house Diane was standing in front of with a locksmith and a triumphant little smile had never belonged to her for a single day of her life. I grew up in Millbrook, a town of about 14,000 people 40 minutes outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the kind of place with one real grocery store, a main street with more empty storefronts than full ones, a diner that still takes only cash on Sundays, and a water tower you can see from almost every backyard in town. The house at 214 Larkspur Lane sat on 3/4 of an acre at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, a 2-story colonial with faded blue shutters and a front porch swing that had been there since before I was born. My mother picked out the blue paint. I know that because my father told me, so every single time we repainted it, like it was a small prayer he needed to say out loud. My mother died when I was 12. Ovarian cancer, the kind that doesn't announce itself until it's already made itself at home in your body. I remember the smell of the hospital more than I remember most of the actual conversations. An antiseptic smell mixed with the vanilla lotion she kept in her bag, and I remember that the hallway outside her room was always exactly 68 degrees, cold enough that I kept my father's flannel jacket on even in July. After she died, my father worked with his hands to keep himself from falling apart. He was a union electrician, out the door by 6 a.m. most mornings, home with sawdust or wire insulation dust still caught in the creases of his knuckles most nights. His hands were rough in a way that told the truth about a person. Thick calluses across the palm, a permanent line of grime under 2 fingernails that no amount of scrubbing ever fully lifted. He built our back deck himself the summer after my mother died, working until it was too dark to see the level, like if he kept his hands busy enough the grief couldn't catch up to him. Before Diane, it was just the 2 of us for 3 years, and I think, if I'm honest, those were some of the strangest and closest years of my life. My father was not a naturally talkative man, but grief had made him strangely open with me, in the specific way that some parents become almost like peers to their kids after a shared loss. He taught me how to change a car battery in the driveway on a Saturday morning when I was 13, narrating every step like it mattered, like I was an apprentice and not just a kid keeping him company. He let me ride along in his truck to job sites some Saturdays, and I would sit on an overturned bucket in somebody's half-finished basement reading library books while he ran conduit, and every couple hours he'd hand me a granola bar from his lunch cooler without a word, like it was a small ritual between us that didn't need explaining. Those years are the ones I go back to most, even now. They are the ones that make everything after them hurt in a very specific way, because I know exactly what having a whole, uncomplicated family felt like, briefly, and I know exactly what it felt like to watch it get carefully, quietly dismantled. He married Diane when I was 15. She was a real estate agent with a good tan and a laugh that arrived half a second late, like she was checking the room's temperature before deciding how loud to be. She had a daughter from a previous marriage, Vanessa, 2 years older than me, who wore her hair perfectly straightened even to go to the grocery store, and who called my father Robert instead of anything warmer for the entire 6 years he was married to her mother. Vanessa and I were never close, though we were never openly hostile either. For most of those years, we existed more like two guests who had been assigned the same table at a wedding, polite, occasionally friendly, never quite sure whether we were supposed to be building something more than politeness. I remember the wedding itself in strange, specific fragments, the way you remember things when you're 15 and trying very hard to be happy for someone because you're supposed to be. It was a small ceremony at a vineyard outside town, string lights strung between 2 oak trees, and Diane wore ivory instead of white, which I now understand was a small, deliberate signal I was too young to read at the time. She hugged me at the reception, briefly, her perfume sharp and expensive smelling, and said into my ear, "I always wanted a daughter who was almost grown already. Save so much of the hard part." I laughed because it sounded like a joke, and it took me years to understand that it wasn't entirely one. I want to be fair because fairness matters to me even now, even after everything. Diane was never cruel to me in front of my father. She was careful. She was the kind of person who could make you feel small in a room full of people and have every single other person in that room believe she had simply been kind. She would say things like, "Josie's such a trooper, considering," and let the sentence hang there unfinished so that everyone in earshot filled in their own ending. Considering what? Considering her mother died. Considering her father spent his weekends at Home Depot instead of taking her on vacations. Considering she wasn't, in the end, really Diane's daughter, and everyone in the room understood that without Diane ever having to say the word stepdaughter out loud. The first signal that something was deeply wrong came almost a year before my father died, though I didn't recognize it as a signal at the time. I only recognized it in hindsight, the way you can only see a rattlesnake's shape in the grass after you already know it's there. My father had been having chest pains for months, small ones he waved off as heartburn or getting older, and one Sunday afternoon I walked into the kitchen to grab a glass of water and heard Diane on the phone with Vanessa, her voice pitched low but not low enough. "If something happens to Robert," she was saying, turning a wine glass slowly by its stem on the counter, "we need to make sure the house paperwork is straightened out before Josie turns 21. That's the thing I keep telling him. That's the thing that actually matters." I remember standing in the doorway with the refrigerator door still open, cold air rolling out around my ankles, and thinking, what does my birthday have to do with the house paperwork? I didn't ask. I told myself I had misheard the context. I told myself a lot of things over those years that I now understand were simply the sound of my own instincts trying to get my attention, quietly, the way instincts do before you're ready to listen to them. There was another small signal, months before that phone call, that I only understood afterward as part of the same pattern. Diane kept a leather folio in the drawer of the hallway console table, the kind realtors use for open house flyers, and every so often I would notice it sitting slightly open, papers shuffled in a different order than I remembered, as if someone had gone through it recently and not quite managed to put everything back the way they found it. I never once looked inside it myself. That would come much later, in a different form entirely, but I remember the odd, prickling feeling of walking past that console table and sensing, the way you sense a draft from a window you can't locate, that there was a version of my family's paperwork that existed somewhere other than in the fireproof box in my father's closet. My father died on a Thursday in March at work of a heart attack on a ladder with a wire stripper still in his hand. He was 54 years old. I was 20. I got the call at Dr. Okafor's office, in the middle of sterilizing instruments, and I remember that the autoclave was still hissing steam when I dropped the phone, and that the sound of that steam is the sound I now associate, permanently and without my permission, with the worst 9 seconds of my life. At the funeral, Diane wore black that fit her like she'd had it tailored for the occasion months in advance, which, I would later come to believe, was closer to the truth than any of us understood that day. She cried in exactly the right places, She squeezed my hand at the graveside with exactly the right pressure. And 3 days later, sitting at our kitchen table, the same table my father built from reclaimed barnwood a year before he met her, she told me, gently, that grief takes time, and that she and Vanessa needed to start thinking practically about the house, and that I shouldn't worry. She would handle everything. I let her handle everything. I was 20 years old, and I had just watched them lower my father into the ground next to my mother, and I did not have a single ounce of fight left in my body. That is the piece of a story I need you to understand before anything else. I did not fight back at first, not because I was weak, but because grief had temporarily rearranged what I was capable of caring about. Diane understood this. I believe now that she understood it with a precision that borders on strategy. Grief is a window. Some people close it gently for you to what had been my father's home office, the room where he used to sit at his desk on Sunday nights doing the crossword with a mug of decaf going cold beside him. I would walk past that room and see Vanessa's yoga mat rolled out on the floor where his desk chair used to sit, and something in my chest would tighten like a fist closing slowly around a stone. I told myself this was temporary. I told myself grief was making everything feel sharper than it actually was. I went to my community college classes 3 nights a week. I was working toward my associates in dental hygiene, one class short of finishing the prerequisites I needed to apply to the actual hygiene program, and I picked up every shift Dr. Okafor would give me, because even though the house was, as far as I knew, still my father's estate working its way through probate, Diane had made it very clear, in the specific unspoken way she made things clear, that I needed to start contributing, if I wanted to keep living there. Even after Diane moved in, my father kept one small ritual just between the two of us, and I think it's the detail that best proves the relationship was real and not something I'm only romanticizing now that he's gone. Every Sunday morning, before anyone else in the house was awake, he would leave a mug of instant coffee on the counter for me. Not made the way I actually liked it. Always a little too strong, always with too much sugar because he could never remember exactly how much I took, and he would already be out on the back porch by the time I came down, not saying a word about it, just glancing up and nodding once when I sat beside him with the mug in my hands. It wasn't good coffee. It was never about the coffee. It was the fact that even with an entirely new family arranged around him, he still woke up early enough to make sure that 15 minutes, every single Sunday, belonged only to us. I want to tell you about one moment before the ugliness started, because you deserve to know this house was real to me, that it wasn't just a legal asset in a story about money. The week before my father died, we sat on the back porch he built with his own hands, and he handed me a mug of a terrible instant coffee he always drank, and he said out of nowhere, "This house is going to be yours one day, Josie Bug. Not Diane's, not Vanessa's, yours. Your mom and I built a life in this yard. I need you to know that, whatever happens, whatever anybody tells you later." I remember laughing a little, because it felt like a strange, heavy thing to say on an ordinary Tuesday evening, and I told him he was being morbid, and he just smiled that quiet smile of his and said, "Morbid's just another word for prepared." I didn't understand, that evening, exactly how prepared he had been. I would understand it completely 11 months later, at 9:14 on a Wednesday morning, standing in a lawyer's office with my hands shaking around a manila folder. I remember one dinner party in particular, the spring I turned 17, when Diane hosted 6 of my father's co-workers and their wives in our backyard, stringing up the same kind of lights from her wedding, setting out a table runner she'd ironed herself. She made a lemon tart from scratch that year, and when one of the wives asked for the recipe, Diane laughed her half-beat late laugh and said, "Oh, it's nothing. Really, anyone could do it," in a voice so warm and easy that the whole table seemed to lean toward her a little. I stood in the kitchen doorway that night, 17 years old, watching my father look at her like she'd hung the moon over our yard herself, and I remember thinking, with a kind of quiet ache I couldn't name yet, that I wanted to be looked at like that by someone too someday. It wasn't jealousy, exactly. It was closer to homesickness for something I'd never actually had. Diane, on the surface, was the kind of stepmother you'd want your friends to meet. She hosted a beautiful Thanksgiving. She remembered everyone's coffee order. She had a laugh that made strangers in restaurants turn and smile without knowing why. For 6 years, most people who met her walked away thinking my father had been lucky to find her. That surface was not fake so much as it was selective. She showed people exactly the version of herself that served her, and she was extremely good at it. Good the way a real estate agent is good at making a house with a cracked foundation look, in the right light and with the right staging, absolutely move-in ready. The explicit insult, the one that finally cracked something open in me, came on that Tuesday afternoon in the driveway, with the locksmith kneeling at the door and Diane standing there with her sunglasses pushed up into her hair like a woman posing for a magazine spread titled Woman Who Has Won. "You'll never own anything, Josephine. This house is mine now. I'd start looking at apartments if I were you." She said it with a small, satisfied smile, the kind of smile you give when you believe, with total confidence, that you have already checked every possible exit and found them all locked from your side. She had no idea that 11 days later, she would be the one standing outside a locked door. I didn't scream. I didn't cry in that driveway. Not one tear, though God knows I wanted to. I stood there and I said, very quietly, "Okay," and I walked past her into the house I had lived in my entire life, up the stairs to my old bedroom, and I sat down on the edge of my bed with my hands in my lap and I thought, something is wrong here. Not wrong the way grief is wrong. Wrong the way a locked door is wrong when you didn't lose the key. You were never given one in the first place. That night, after Diane and Vanessa had gone out to what Diane called a celebration dinner, with a realtor named Chip who had been circling our house like a hawk for 2 months, I went looking for my father's old fireproof lockbox. I knew exactly where it was because I had watched him put important papers into it 100 times over the years. Insurance documents, our birth certificates, the deed to his truck. It used to sit on the top shelf of his closet, behind a stack of folded flannel shirts that still, 8 months later, smelled faintly like sawdust and Old Spice. The box wasn't in the closet. I found it, an hour later, shoved into a corner of the garage behind a stack of paint cans, half hidden under a moving blanket, like someone had tried to make it disappear without quite having the nerve to throw it away. The box itself was smaller than I remembered from childhood, gray metal gone slightly rusted at one corner, with a dent along the lid where I'd once dropped it off a shelf as a kid, and my father had laughed instead of scolding me. It smelled, when I finally got it open, like old paper and pencil shavings and, faintly, like the cedar shelf liner from his closet, a smell I hadn't encountered in 8 months, and that hit me harder than I expected a smell had any right to. My hands went cold lifting it out. In September, warm night, the garage still holding the day's heat, the concrete floor faintly warm even through my socks, and my hands went cold anyway, the way they do right before your body knows something your mind hasn't caught up to yet. The lock had been forced. Someone had already been inside. I carried it up to my room and sat on the floor with my back against the bed frame, and I opened it slowly, the way you open something when part of you already suspects it's going to change your life and you want to hold on to the last 5 seconds of not knowing. Inside, there was a stack of papers that didn't look like anything I recognized from my father's usual filing. Not our old birth certificates, not his truck title. There was a manila folder, slightly bent at one corner, with a Harrisburg law firm's letterhead across the top, Whitfield & Sons, Trust and Estate Law, and clipped to the front of it, in my father's handwriting, on a torn half-sheet of notebook paper, 4 words, "For Josie." Read this first. My hands were shaking, so hard I had to set the folder down on the carpet and press my palms flat against my knees for a second before I could pick it back up. The papers inside were a trust document. Not a will, a trust, established 9 years earlier, back when I was 12, the same year my mother died, funded and structured by my paternal grandfather, a man named Walter Hart, who I barely remembered because he had passed away when I was young and had lived 3 states away for most of his life. I knew, vaguely, growing up, that my grandfather had done well for himself. He'd owned a small chain of hardware stores across 2 counties and had quietly bought and rented out a handful of properties over the decades, the kind of unglamorous real estate wealth that never shows up in a person's clothes or car, only in the paperwork nobody ever thinks to ask about. What I did not know, what I had never once been told, by my father or anyone else, was that when my grandfather died, he had placed the deed to 214 Larkspur Lane into an irrevocable trust with a single, specific beneficiary named on every document, me, Josephine Marie Hart. Not my father, not any future stepmother, me. The terms were laid out in language so plain that even at 21, sitting on my bedroom floor at 11 o'clock at night with my heart going too fast, I understood every word of it. My grandfather had structured it so that my father held the right to live in the house, rent-free, as a life tenant, for as long as he lived, on the condition that the property taxes and mortgage insurance stayed current, which my father had paid, every month, without fail, out of his own paycheck for 9 years. But the moment my father passed away, and the moment I turned 21, which had happened 4 months earlier, on a Saturday in May that Diane had marked with exactly 1 store-bought cake and 0 acknowledgement of what that birthday legally triggered, full and complete ownership of the house transferred to me. Not to my father's estate, not to Diane, who was never named anywhere in the trust, not once, not even as a footnote. To me, there was a second document clipped behind the trust, a letter, handwritten, in my father's careful block print, the same handwriting I'd watched him use to label circuit breaker panels my whole childhood. Josie Bug, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and it means you finally found the box, which, knowing you, probably took you longer than it should have, because you never did like snooping through my things, even when I told you to. Your grandfather set this house up for you before your mom got sick, before any of the rest of this happened, because he believed, and I believed it too, that a person should have one piece of solid ground in this world that nobody can take from them, no matter what else happens to the family around them. I never told Diane the full terms of the trust. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like I was hiding something from my own wife, and maybe I was, but I want you to understand why. In the 2nd year of our marriage, I made the mistake of mentioning, just in passing, that the house would go to you someday. I watched her face change for about 4 seconds before she caught herself and smiled again. 4 seconds, Josie. That's all it took for me to understand something about her I never fully unlearned. After that, I told her the house was in my name outright, the way most houses are, and I let her believe that. I'm not proud of the lie. I am proud of what it protected. Whatever she's told you, whatever she does after I'm gone, the house was never hers to give away, and it was never hers to take from you. It was your grandfather's gift, and it is your birthright, and there is not one signature on this earth that changes that. I love you more than the words on this page know how to say. Take care of yourself. Take care of the house. Your mother's roses are still out back if you dig past the mulch. I never had the heart to pull them. Dad, I read the letter 3 times before I let myself stand up off that floor. The first time, I don't think I actually absorbed a single sentence. My eyes moved across the words, but my chest was doing something too loud to let any of it land. The second time, I read it slowly out loud, in a whisper, the way you might read something to make sure it's actually real and not something your grief has invented for you out of pure need. The third time, I found myself running my thumb over the specific place where his handwriting pressed harder into the page, over the words your birthright, like the ink itself might still hold some warmth if I touched it long enough. The carpet under me had gone slightly damp where I'd been sitting so long, and somewhere down the hall I could hear the ordinary sounds of the house going on without any idea what had just happened inside my bedroom. The hum of the refrigerator, a car passing on Larkspur Lane with its headlights, briefly sliding across my ceiling, the distant tick of the old radiator my father never got around to replacing. It was 11:53 at night. I remember checking, out of the same old habit he'd taught me, know what time something happened, as if some part of me already understood I would need to prove, someday, exactly when I learned the truth. I sat on that floor and I cried the way I hadn't let myself cry since the funeral, quietly, into my own knees for a long time. Not from anger yet. That came later. First it was just grief, clean and enormous, the kind that has nothing to do with money or houses at all. But underneath the grief, something else had started to settle into my chest, slow and deliberate, like furniture being carried into a room I hadn't asked to have furnished. It felt almost like calm. It felt like the particular stillness that comes right before you understand exactly what you're going to do next. I did not go downstairs and confront Diane that night. I want to be honest about why, because I think it matters for anyone listening to this who has ever been the person sitting quietly on evidence, waiting. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was arithmetic. I had 1 lockbox of documents and a locksmith drilling into a deadbolt 11 days from now, and Diane had a real estate agent, a moving truck already being scheduled, and, I would learn later, an offer on the house already accepted from a young couple relocating from Philadelphia, contingent on a 30-day close. If I walked downstairs that night and waved a stack of papers at her, she would have every advantage of preparation and none of the consequence. I needed someone who understood trust law better than I did, someone who could tell me, in plain language, whether what I was holding was as ironclad as it looked, or whether grief and hope were making me see something that wasn't really there. The next morning, before my shift, I called the law firm on the letterhead, Whitfield and Sons. A woman answered, warm-voiced, and when I gave her my name, there was a pause, a real one, a few seconds long before she said, Josephine Hart. Yes, we've actually been trying to reach you. Mr. Whitfield handled your grandfather's original trust. He's been expecting your call for some time now, actually, since your father passed. That sentence rearranged something in me. He'd been expecting my call. My father had made sure, somewhere along the way, that if I ever found that box, there would be someone on the other end of the phone ready to catch me. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay awake staring at the water stain on my ceiling that had been there since a storm in 8th grade, running through every possible way the conversation with Diane could go if I simply walked downstairs right then and put the folder on the counter in front of her. In every version I imagined, she found a way to make it sound smaller than it was, or slower than it was, or somehow, impossibly, still hers. By the time the sun came up gray through my blinds, I had decided I did not trust myself yet to carry this alone. I needed someone whose entire profession was untangling exactly this kind of thing, someone Diane couldn't outcharm or outargue, because I already knew, from 6 years of watching her work a room, that charm and argument were the two tools she was best at using. Elliot Whitfield was 63 years old, silver-haired, with reading glasses that lived on a chain around his neck, and an office that smelled like old paper and coffee that had gone slightly bitter from sitting too long on the warmer. He'd handled my grandfather's estate planning for over 20 years, and he remembered, with startling clarity, the specific afternoon my grandfather sat across from him and said he wanted the house protected from anybody who might come along later and see it as a windfall instead of a home. Mr. Whitfield pulled the original file, laid it open on the desk between us, and walked me through every page with a patience I will be grateful for as long as I live. "This is airtight, Josephine," he told me, tapping the trust document with 2 fingers. "Your grandfather structured it as a remainder interest with a life estate for your father. The moment your father passed, and given that you'd already turned 21, the property became yours outright, free and clear, by operation of law. It doesn't require a court to grant it to you. It doesn't require your stepmother's agreement. It transferred automatically the day your father died. Legally speaking, Josephine, every day since your father's funeral, you have been the sole owner of that house. Your stepmother has been living in your home." I sat very still in that leather chair, and I said the thing I had been afraid to say out loud since the night before. "She's already got a buyer for it. There's a moving truck coming in 11 days. Mr. Whitfield took his glasses off slowly and set them on the desk, and he looked at me the way I imagine a person looks at someone they respect. "Then," he said, "we don't have 11 days to waste feeling sorry about any of this. We have 11 days to make sure she understands, in a room full of witnesses, exactly whose signature was never on that deed to begin with." He said one more thing to me that afternoon that I have carried with me every day since, the kind of sentence that sounds almost too simple until you've lived the story that makes it true. "People like your stepmother," he said, sliding the folder back into its drawer, "aren't afraid of confrontation, Josephine. They're excellent at confrontation when they're the ones holding the power in the room. What they're actually afraid of, the thing that truly unravels them, is being confronted by someone they never once considered a threat. That's the moment they can't recover from. Not because the truth is loud, because they never saw it coming. For the next 11 days, I did something that, looking back, is still the hardest performance I've ever given, harder than any exam, harder than any conversation at my father's funeral. I went to work at Dr. Okafor's office every morning, cleaned my instruments, smiled at patients, answered the phone in my normal voice. I came home in the evenings, and I helped Diane label moving boxes with a Sharpie, standing in the kitchen my father built the table for, writing kitchen, and master bedroom on cardboard in my own handwriting while she hummed along to the radio like she was decorating for a party. I let her believe, completely, that I had accepted her version of events, that the house was hers, that I would be finding an apartment, that in a few weeks I would simply be somewhere else and she would never have to think about me again. On the third day, Dr. Okafor noticed something was wrong before I said a word about it. He always did, the way good employers notice when someone's hands are a little too steady, too deliberate, cleaning the same instrument tray twice without needing to. He pulled me into his office at the end of my shift, closed the door, and asked, in the plain, unhurried way he asks patients about pain levels, whether I was all right. I hadn't planned to tell him anything. I ended up telling him almost everything, sitting in the chair across from his desk with a paper cup of water going warm in my hands. He listened without interrupting, the way he listens to a nervous patient describe a symptom, and when I finished he said, "Take whatever hours you need next week. Paid. And Josephine," he paused, choosing the words the way he chooses words with patients who are scared of what comes next. "People like your stepmother count on grief making people small and quiet forever. It doesn't. It just takes some people longer than others to remember how to take up space again." I have thought about that sentence almost as often as I've thought about Mr. Whitfield's. On the fourth day, Diane actually handed me a roll of packing tape and asked me, almost sweetly, to start on my own bedroom, since you'll want to be careful with your things, unlike the movers. I stood in my childhood room that evening folding my clothes into a box, and it occurred to me that she genuinely believed she was being generous, letting me pack my own belongings instead of having strangers do it. I taped that box shut, wrote Josie in block letters across the top exactly the way my father used to label his job site bins, and I set it by my closet door where she would see it every time she walked past, evidence of my apparent surrender. I have never before or since done something that felt so much like acting. I called Mr. Whitfield's office most mornings before my shift, standing in the dental office parking lot with my coffee going cold in the cup holder, and each call added another brick to what he called, without a hint of drama, the record. He had an assistant pull certified copies from the county recorder, the original trust filing, the deed transfer dated the day of my father's death, each document stamped and sealed in a way that made the whole strange, private grief of the last 11 months suddenly look like something official, something that had always existed whether Diane acknowledged it or not. I photographed the lockbox itself, still dented from where someone had forced the lock, and Mr. Whitfield had that photograph time-stamped and entered alongside everything else, in case anyone later tried to argue the documents themselves had been tampered with or planted. The advisor's wisdom that stayed with me longest, though, came on the 7th day, sitting across from him at his desk while he reviewed the purchase agreement Diane had already signed. I asked him, honestly, why any of this mattered so much to her. She had, after all, a real estate business of her own, a life outside this house. He took his glasses off, the way he did whenever he wanted me to really hear something, and said, "People don't fight this hard over a house, Josephine. They fight this hard over the story the house lets them tell about themselves." To her, selling this place and splitting the money was proof she'd built something. Losing it in front of witnesses isn't just losing a house. It's losing the story. I have thought about that sentence more times than almost anything else anyone has ever said to me. Some nights, sitting at that same kitchen table over a bowl of cereal I didn't have much appetite for, I would watch her scroll through paint swatches on her phone for whatever new house she was planning to buy with the proceeds, and something would settle in my chest like a stone dropped slowly into still water. Not rage exactly. Something colder and steadier than rage. My grandfather's letter had said whatever else happens to the family around them, and I understood, sitting there, that this was exactly what he had meant. I was the one solid piece of ground, and everyone around me had spent the last 11 months building on top of it without ever checking whose name was on the deed. Mr. Whitfield and I worked quickly and quietly. We pulled a certified copy of the trust and a recorded deed transfer from the county recorder's office, which listed me, in plain black ink, as the property's sole legal owner as of the date of my father's death. We requested and received a full copy of the real estate listing Diane had put the house under, along with a signed purchase agreement she had already executed with the Philadelphia couple, a purchase agreement, Mr. Whitfield pointed out with a raised eyebrow, that Diane had signed as owner, under penalty of perjury, on a property she had never once legally owned. He drafted a formal cease and desist letter to the title company handling the closing, halting the sale before it could go one step further. And on the 9th day, almost by accident, I found the piece of evidence that I will admit gave me a small, sharp satisfaction I am not entirely ashamed of. Vanessa had left her laptop open on the kitchen counter one evening while she went out to get takeout, and a text thread was still open on the screen, synced from her phone, between her and her mother. I want to be clear that I did not go looking for it. I saw it because it was simply sitting there, bright and open, the way a screen sits open in an empty room. But once I saw the first line, I could not look away, and I photographed all of it with my own phone, time-stamped, before Vanessa came back through the door. Diane, 6:47 p.m. Chip says the Wickham offer is solid. They want to close in 30 days. We just need Josie out before the walkthrough. She'll be gone by spring anyway. She's got nowhere else to be. It's not like she has options. Vanessa, 6:49 p.m. LOL true. She's basically been a charity case since Dad Robert married in. Not even really family TBH. Get the money. Sell it, done. I read those 2 messages more times than I probably needed to. Charity case. Not even really family. She's got nowhere else to be. I felt my hands go cold again, the way they had the night I opened the lockbox. And then, underneath the cold, something else arrived. Quiet, clean, almost peaceful. They had no idea, not even a small idea. They believed, with complete confidence, that the story ended the way they had written it in that text thread. They did not know that in 2 days, a woman named Diane Hart was going to stand in her own kitchen and learn, in front of a room full of people, exactly whose charity she had actually been living on for the last 8 months. Mr. Whitfield notarized the screenshots the following morning, along with a sworn declaration from me establishing when and how they were obtained, and he added them to a growing folder that, by the 10th day, sat nearly 2 inches thick on the corner of his desk. He also did one more thing I hadn't expected, and it was this, more than anything, that made me finally believe the ground under my feet was as solid as my father promised it would be. He called the title company's underwriting department himself and requested, quietly, formally, through channels Diane would have no visibility into, that the closing scheduled for the 11th day be moved from a private signing to the title company's conference room, at the specific request of the beneficial owner of record, with all interested parties invited to attend. Diane, when the title agent called to confirm the change of venue, apparently assumed it was simply a scheduling convenience. She had no idea the beneficial owner of record the paperwork referred to as me. The 11th day arrived on a Saturday, bright and unseasonably warm for late September, the kind of golden afternoon light that makes even ordinary rooms look like something out of a memory you haven't had yet. Diane had scheduled the final walkthrough and closing at the title company's office on Chestnut Street at 11 in the morning, and she had, in a move I found almost funny in hindsight, invited half the extended family to what she was calling a closing brunch afterward at the house. Her sister, 2 cousins of my father's she barely tolerated most years, even Chip the realtor's assistant, all gathered to celebrate the tidy, profitable end of a story she believed was entirely hers to write. I walked into that conference room at 10:58 in the morning wearing the navy blazer I usually save for job interviews, my hair pulled back, a manila folder under my arm that felt, physically, lighter than I expected given everything it contained. Mr. Whitfield walked in beside me, in a gray suit that looked like it had seen 40 years of exactly this kind of room, carrying his own briefcase and the particular calm of a man who has done this 100 times and still finds it satisfying every single time. The conference room smelled like the carpet cleaner they must have run through it that morning, faintly chemical under the coffee, and the air conditioning was turned up high enough that I could feel goosebumps rise along my arms the second I walked through the door, cold enough, oddly, that it reminded me for half a second of the hospital hallway where my mother had spent her last weeks, 68 degrees. The same temperature grief always seems to arrive at. A long window along the far wall let in that golden late September light, cutting a bright rectangle across the table, right where Diane happened to be sitting, like even the room itself hadn't decided yet whose side it was on. Diane was already seated at the long conference table, laughing lightly at something the title agent had said, a cup of coffee in front of her, Chip the realtor to her left, Vanessa scrolling her phone beside him. She looked up when I walked in, and her smile flickered, just slightly, confused rather than alarmed, the way you look at a coworker who shows up at a meeting you weren't expecting them to attend. "Josie," she said. "Sweetheart, this is a closing. You didn't need to." "I know what it is," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected it to, quiet, but completely level. I set the folder down on the table in front of the title agent, not in front of Diane. Before anyone signs anything today, there's something everyone in this room has a legal right to see. I want to tell you, because it matters, that I did not raise my voice once. Not that day, not in that room. My father spent 9 years being the calmest man in every room he was ever in, even the hospital room where my mother was dying, and I understood, sitting there, that I had learned that from him without ever realizing I was being taught. I opened the folder and slid the certified deed across the table first, 1 page at a time, the way Mr. Whitfield had coached me, never all at once. "This is the recorded deed transfer from the county recorder's office," I said. "It shows that as of March 14th of this year, the date my father passed away, full ownership of 214, Larkspur Lane transferred by trust to me. Not to my father's estate. To me, individually, as the named beneficiary of a trust my grandfather established 9 years ago." The title agent, a woman named Renata who I would come to be genuinely grateful for, picked up the document, read it for perhaps 10 seconds, and set it down with an expression that told me she had already understood exactly what this meant for the transaction sitting in front of her. Diane laughed, a short, disbelieving sound, the kind of laugh people use when they need a half-second to figure out how alarmed to actually be. "That's Josie. Honey, that can't be right. This house has been in Robert's name since before I even met him. I have the mortgage statements. Your husband's name was on the mortgage," Mr. Whitfield said, in the same unhurried tone he'd used with me across his desk 11 days earlier. As a life tenant, per the trust, he was responsible for the mortgage and the taxes for as long as he lived in the home. That obligation ended, along with his life tenancy, the moment he passed. Ownership of the underlying property was never his to sell, Mrs. Hart, which means it was never yours to inherit, and it was never yours to list. I watched something shift across Diane's face in real time, the first stage, exactly as Mr. Whitfield had described it to me the week before, sitting in his office. "Denial. This is insane," she said, her voice rising slightly, reaching for the deed and turning it over as though the back of the page might contradict the front. "There has to be some mistake, some paperwork error. Robert would have told me if—" "He did tell you," I said, and I slid the second document across the table, a photocopy of my father's handwritten letter, the one that began Josie Bug. "If you're reading this, he told you the house was in his name outright. That's what you believed, because that's what he let you believe, because 4 years into your marriage you mentioned, out loud, that the house would someday belong to me, and my father watched your face for 4 seconds before you remembered to smile again. I have never, in my life, seen a room go as quiet as that conference room when in that moment." Vanessa had stopped scrolling her phone. Chip the realtor was very carefully studying the surface of the table. Diane's face had gone from confusion to something harder, and this was the second stage, the pivot, exactly on schedule. "Okay," she said, forcing her voice into something smoother, reasonable, the tone I imagined she used on nervous first-time homebuyers 100 times over the years. "Okay, Josie, let's not do this in front of everyone. Whatever's on that paper, we're family. We can work something out between us. I can let you stay in the house. We can figure out an arrangement that's fair, too." "I don't need you to let me stay in my own house," I said. "And I'm not interested in an arrangement. I'm here to stop a sale of property you never owned, and to let the people in this room know that as of this morning, effective immediately, you and Vanessa will need to vacate 214, Larkspur Lane." "Josie, please," she said, her voice dropping into something softer, more urgent, and I recognized it immediately as the same voice she used to close hesitant clients, the one built specifically to make people feel like the decision had already been made and all that was left was the comfortable part. "You don't need a lawyer to tell you what family owes each other. I raised you for 6 years. I was there for your prom, for your graduation. I sat with you at the hospital the night your father—" She stopped, recalibrated, tried a different angle. "Let's step outside, just the two of us, and talk about this like adults. I can make sure you get something out of the sale. A fair amount. More than fair. We don't need Renata and Chip and this whole room to settle a family matter." I looked at her for a long moment before I answered, and I felt, for just a second, that old childhood instinct to make the room comfortable again, to smooth things over the way I'd been trained to do for 6 years. Then I thought about the box in my closet at home and the 4 seconds in my father's letter, and I said, "There's nothing to settle, Diane. The house was never yours to offer me a percentage of." Her jaw tightened, and the softness in her voice evaporated as quickly as it had arrived. The pivot broke almost instantly into the third stage. Diane's voice cracked upward, sharp, all the careful smoothness gone at once. "You ungrateful little, do you have any idea what I have done for you the last 6 years? I have put up with you sulking around that house like a ghost since your mother died. I raised you when your father was too busy grieving to notice you needed anything, and this is—" She stopped herself half a second too late, but half a second was all it took because Vanessa, still holding her phone, had unlocked the screen out of nervous habit, and the same text thread from 9 days earlier was still sitting open in her messages, visible to anyone glancing at the table. The words "she's basically been a charity case" still lit up on the screen in plain view of the title agent, the realtor, and Mr. Whitfield, all of whom I watched read it in the same silent half-second. I didn't have to say a single word about those texts. I had planned, if it came to it, to bring them up myself, but I didn't need to. Diane's own daughter had left the evidence sitting open on a table in a legally recorded closing meeting, and the room had read it without me lifting a finger. Mr. Whitfield stood at that point, unhurried, and said the sentence that formally ended it, the sentence I have replayed in my mind more times than I can count since that day. "Mrs. Hart, the sale you scheduled for today cannot proceed, as the seller of record was never the legal owner of the property. My client, Josephine Hart, is the sole title holder of 214 Larkspur Lane, effective the day of her father's death, and has been for the past 6 months while you and your daughter have resided there without her knowledge or consent. I'll be filing the appropriate notice with the title company this afternoon, along with a formal request that you and your daughter vacate the premises within 30 days, in accordance with standard notice requirements for occupants without legal tenancy. If you'd like to dispute any of this, you're welcome to retain counsel, though I'd advise against it, given what's already been entered into the record here today." Diane did not cry. She did not apologize. She gathered her purse off the back of her chair with hands that were, I noticed, shaking slightly despite how hard she was working to keep her face composed. And for one strange second, right before she turned toward the door, she looked at me, not with anger, not with the cold triumph she'd worn in the driveway 11 days earlier, but with something almost bewildered, almost young, like a woman remembering, very briefly, that she used to be someone who brought me soup the one time I had the flu badly enough to miss 2 weeks of school, someone who once cried real tears at my high school graduation, before I fully understood how much of that had been performance, and how much, if any, had been real. It lasted less than 2 seconds. Then it was gone, replaced by the mask again, and she said, to no one in particular, "This is absolutely not over," and walked out of that conference room without looking at me again. I have thought about those 2 seconds more than I expected to. I don't think they undo anything she did. I think they simply mean she was a whole person too, capable of more than the worst thing she chose, and that is its own kind of sad, separate from anything I owe her. I sat in my car in the parking lot outside the title company for almost 20 minutes afterward, engine off, hands in my lap, not triumphant, not really anything I had a clean word for. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a delivery van idling 2 spots over, its exhaust shimmering faintly in the September heat, and I remember focusing on that small, unrelated detail because it was easier than looking directly at what had just happened. My phone buzzed twice with messages from Mr. Whitfield's assistant confirming the filing had gone through, and I read them both without fully registering the words, the way you read something important right after a car accident, technically comprehending but not yet feeling it. I thought about my father on that back porch, handing me his terrible instant coffee, telling me this house is going to be yours one day, Josie Bug. I thought about my mother's roses still buried somewhere under the mulch behind that house, waiting for someone to dig them out. And I thought, with a complicated ache I hadn't expected, about the version of Diane I used to believe existed somewhere underneath all of it. The woman who remembered everyone's coffee order, who had in 6 years occasionally been kind to me in small, real ways I hadn't let myself forget even now. The woman from the dinner party with the lemon tart and the lights strung between the trees. I felt grief for that version of her too, the one who might have chosen differently and never did. That complexity surprised me. I think it's supposed to. I didn't call anyone right away. I just sat there, in the quiet, cold air conditioning finally shutting off inside the car, until my own breathing slowed down enough to match it, and then I drove home alone, to a house that had, as of that morning, become entirely and undeniably my own for the very first time. The 30-day vacate notice was honored, eventually, though not without one final ugly phone call from Diane threatening a lawyer she never actually retained, because Mr. Whitfield's paperwork left her, in his words, nothing to sue with. She called me one more time after that, late on a Sunday night, and for about 90 seconds she cycled back through all 3 stages I'd already watched her move through in the conference room, first insisting there had been some clerical mistake somewhere, then offering, almost pleading, to split whatever proceeds a future sale might bring if I would simply let this go quietly, and finally, when I said nothing at all, telling me I would regret shutting my own family out someday. I let her finish. Then I said, "Good night, Diane," and hung up, and she has not called since. Diane and Vanessa moved into a 2-bedroom rental apartment across town, the kind of place with a shared laundry room and a parking lot instead of a driveway. I heard, secondhand, through a cousin who still speaks to both sides, that the moving couple from Philadelphia who'd had an accepted offer on the house were, understandably, furious with Diane and Chip, and that Chip's brokerage quietly let him go a few months later over the whole affair, after the title company flagged the botched closing in their compliance file. Diane went back to selling real estate for a smaller firm 2 towns over, the kind of office with a sign that still says its previous owner's name in faded vinyl letters under the new one. Vanessa, last I heard, was working the counter at a phone store in the same strip mall as the old dental office. A coworker of mine ran into her buying a coffee there last winter and said she looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the season. I don't say any of that with satisfaction, exactly. I say it the way you'd read a weather report. Sometimes the bottom is simply where a person ends up when the thing they were standing on was never really theirs to stand on. In the weeks right after the closing that never happened, I didn't feel triumphant so much as unsteady, the way you feel stepping off a boat after a long time at sea, still expecting the ground to move under you even once it stopped. I remember standing in the empty living room a few days after Diane and Vanessa finally moved their last boxes out, running my hand along the wall where my father's old fishing photos used to hang before Diane replaced them with that abstract painting, and feeling, for the first time in almost a year, like I was allowed to put things back exactly where they used to be. I drove to a print shop that same afternoon and had 3 of those old photographs blown up and reframed, and I hung them back on that wall myself, slightly crooked, the way he always used to hang things, because getting them perfectly straight felt, somehow, like erasing him a little. I remember one dinner in particular, on the 8th night, sitting across from Diane at the same barnwood table my father built, eating a chicken casserole she'd made from a recipe card she kept in a little tin box, while she talked cheerfully about paint colors for whatever new house she was picturing herself in by Thanksgiving. I nodded along, asked a question about the school district near the new listing she liked, and passed her the salt when she asked for it, all while the certified copy of the trust document sat folded in my work bag by the front door, 4 feet, and 1 wall away from where we were sitting. I remember thinking, chewing a bite of casserole I barely tasted, that this must be what it feels like to hold 2 entirely different realities in your 2 hands at once, and that my father had apparently done exactly this, quietly, for 9 years, and never once let it show at his own dinner table. I also want to tell you about Renata, the title agent from that closing, because she became something unexpected in the year that followed. Not a friend exactly, not at first, but the first person outside Mr. Whitfield's office who looked at me like a whole adult instead of a girl in the middle of someone else's drama. She called me a few weeks later, off the clock, just to say she hoped I was doing all right, and somewhere in that first conversation we discovered we'd both lost a parent young, and somewhere in the year since that conversation turned into actual friendship, Sunday coffee some weeks, someone to call when the house felt too quiet. My father used to say you find your real family in the people who show up once there's nothing left for them to gain from you. I didn't understand what he meant until Renata, of all people, kept showing up. It has been just over a year now since that morning in the conference room on Chestnut Street. I still live at 214 Larkspur Lane. The blue shutters are the same ones my mother picked out. I repainted them myself last spring, standing on the same ladder my father used to use, and I cried a little doing it, and that felt right. I finished my associate's degree in May and started the dental hygiene program in the fall, and Dr. Okafor, who has become something like family to me over these last 2 years, gave me a raise and a framed card signed by the whole office the week I moved back into the house officially. I study most weeknights now at that same barnwood kitchen table, textbooks and index cards spread across the same surface, where I once quietly ate casserole across from a woman who had already decided I didn't belong there, and there is a specific, ordinary satisfaction in that, reclaiming a table one flashcard at a time instead of one confrontation at a time. I dug through the mulch behind the back porch last April, exactly like my father's letter told me to, and found my mother's rose bushes exactly where he'd left them, tangled and neglected but alive, and I have spent the last 6 months bringing them back, one careful cut at a time, learning from library books and a patient neighbor 2 doors, down what my hands never had the chance to learn from my mother directly. They bloomed for the first time in years this June, and I sat on that back porch with a cup of coffee. Not instant, I can't stand the stuff, but I drink it anyway sometimes, just to feel closer to him, and I watched the roses my mother planted before I was born open up in the same yard where my father built our deck with his own 2 hands. That is the kind of small, mundane joy nobody warns you grief will eventually make room for. Some Sundays now, I still leave a mug of that same terrible instant coffee out on the counter before I sit down outside, even though there's no one left to leave it for. It isn't sad the way it might sound. It's just a small way of keeping a 15-minute ritual alive that once belonged only to the 2 of us. I think about that a lot now, almost a year later, on the nights I can't sleep and end up sitting on the back porch with the light off, listening to the same cicadas my father used to complain kept him up in August. Grief has a strange way of making you audit every relationship you've ever had, going back through old conversations the way I went through that lockbox, looking for the small signals you missed the first time because you weren't ready yet to see them. I found several once I started looking. The 4 seconds my father mentioned in his letter. The way Diane's laugh always arrived half a beat late, checking the room before committing to it. The specific way she used the word considering and let other people finish her sentences for her. None of those signals were loud enough to convict anyone of anything on their own. Together, they were the whole truth, sitting quietly in plain sight the entire time, waiting for someone to stop being too tired, too grieving, too hopeful, to finally add them up. If there is one truth I would want you to carry out of the story with you, it's this. Money does not create the people who hurt us. It only reveals what was already sitting quietly underneath them the whole time. Diane didn't become a different person the day my father died. She simply stopped needing to hide the person she had always been. If you are watching this and you recognize some version of yourself in it, if you are the person in your family who quietly holds everything together while someone else quietly decides what you're worth, I want you to hear this clearly. You loved correctly. Whatever they did with that love afterward is not a reflection of the love itself. Those are 2 completely different things, and it is not your job to keep confusing them. If you are young, 20, 21, 25, still finishing a degree or still working your first real job while also trying to bury a parent and hold a whole household together at the same time, I want you to hear this specifically because I don't think enough of these stories get told about people our age. Grief does not wait for you to be older before it asks everything of you. You are allowed to be exhausted and still be exactly capable enough to protect what's yours. You are allowed to grieve slowly and act decisively at the very same time. Those 2 things are not in conflict, no matter how much it might feel that way at 3 in the morning. If you are the adult child watching a step-parent or a relative slowly take inventory of what your parent left behind, please, this week, do one simple thing. Go to your county recorder's office or check online. In most counties it costs less than $20, and pull the deed to any property you believe you have a stake in. Read every line, not just the summary. If anything on that document surprises you, call an estate attorney before you say a single word to anyone in your family about what you found. You are not being paranoid. You are simply, finally awake. And if your gut has been telling you something for months that you've been talking yourself out of because it's easier to stay quiet, please, just this once, listen to it. It rarely announces itself loudly. Mine showed up as a leather folio left open a little too often, a laugh that arrived half a beat too late, a sentence about a birthday that made no sense until it suddenly made complete sense. The people who work hardest to convince you that you'll never own anything are very often standing on ground that was never theirs to begin with. And some part of you, quietly, almost always already knows it before the paperwork ever catches up. Ask yourself, honestly, is there a room in your own life right now where you've been making yourself smaller so someone else could feel more comfortable? Is there a conversation you've been avoiding because the truth in it might cost you a relationship you've been holding on to out of habit rather than out of love? And if the answer is yes, how much longer, exactly, do you plan on staying that small? I'd genuinely love to know where you're all watching this from tonight, and I mean that more than you'd probably guess from a video like this one. Drop a 1 in the comments if you believe I was right to let those 11 days play out quietly before I said a word, gathering everything I needed before I ever opened my mouth. Drop a 2 if you think you would have confronted her the very first night, lockbox still open on the floor in front of you, unable to wait even 1 more hour for the truth to come out. And drop a 3 if some part of the story touched something real in your own life. A house, a parent, an inheritance, a person who decided, somewhere along the way, quietly and without ever announcing it out loud, that you were worth less than you actually were. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Someone out there is going to watch this at 2 in the morning, unable to sleep, from somewhere I would never expect. Maybe sitting on the edge of a bed they aren't sure is really theirs. Maybe holding a folder of papers they haven't had the courage to open yet. And somehow, this will be the story they needed tonight. That means something to me, every single time, more than any of you probably realize. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Millbrook, Pennsylvania to create original content. Any resemblance to real people, locations, or events is entirely coincidental. If anything in the story matched your real life too closely, please reach out to a licensed attorney, your local adult protective services, or a counselor you trust. You are not alone. And remember, sometimes the truth doesn't arrive with a crash. Sometimes it's just a quiet sound you finally stopped ignoring. Pay attention. Stay kind. Stay awake.